Hey everyone, I'm Billy Hume, and today I'm going to be going over basic mixing habits or practices that you should be doing on every mix. The most important thing you need to get right before you start mixing is your mixing position with your primary speakers. You need to make sure that you're sitting in an equilateral position from your speakers so that your head and your speakers are all the same distance from each other. You also want to make sure that your speakers are at your ear level. Now, sometimes I've got extra speakers. I've got a 2-speaker system here at this studio, and at my main mixing studio, I've got 3 sets of speakers. So I've got these other speakers that sit up on top of my Yamahas. I've angled them down a little bit, but in essence, they are forming the same equal triangle. If you don't have your speakers in the right position, it's going to totally throw off the phase, which means you won't be able to trust your EQ or anything after that. Another good mixing habit is to mix at a low volume. In fact, you should be mixing at a volume that is at the same level as a conversation. If you can't hear somebody across the room talking to you when you're mixing and understand what they're saying, you're mixing too loud. Because think about it, you're going to be mixing for hours, and you'll end up wearing your ears out if you're mixing really loud. Plus, everything sounds good loud. And if you can get a great mix that's very exciting and just really hitting hard at a low volume, well, it's going to work at any volume. When you're mixing, make sure to reference on multiple speakers. Here at this studio where I work most of my time, I've got a set of Yamaha NS10Ms and these Haflers that I switch between when I'm mixing. The Yamahas tend to be more mid-rangey, and they're great for mixing vocals, hearing where vocals and guitars are going to sit in the mix. The Haflers are great for just getting that big low end. With those, are going to be a little more scooped, and I know that the vocals are going to sound a little quieter on those speakers. At my other studio, where I actually do most of my mixing, I've got a 3rd set of speakers, which are these Event PS6s, which I use primarily for checking the sizzle on the top end. They've got these really kind of harsh tweeters, but I know how far I can push them, and they'll distort in the low end a little bit if I'm pushing it too hard, and I know right where that distortion is, so I'm regularly switching between these 3 sets of speakers. Another thing I used to do back in the day was actually set up a consumer-type stereo behind me. So I would actually put it like 6, 7, 8 feet behind me and reference on that once in a while just to see what it sounded like on a cheap stereo system, and kind of throwing it behind me and changing my perspective was very key in helping me figure out certain things about my mixes. So, multiple speakers. Before you start doing any mixing at all, start by pulling all the faders down in your session. This is from a tracking session I did the other day, and you know how it is when you're tracking, you just keep pushing those faders up. First thing I do, whether it's my thing or something that was sent me to mix, is I group everything and I pull every fader down, give myself some headroom, because you don't want to be overdriving all your subgroups, your master fader, anything like that. You want to leave yourself some headroom to work with and space to push those faders back up, which is what you're going to end up doing when you're mixing. Before you start getting too focused and microscoped in on little sections or little aspects of your mix, go through the whole thing and do a nice rough mix. Spend 10, 15 minutes and just work on only volumes and panning, but just get yourself a good rough mix. I think one of the main challenges with mixing is balancing the focus on details with pulling back and listening to the larger picture. It's very important to keep reminding yourself what this is going to sound like all together. So go through, do a quick rough mix. It's also going to kind of get you into the whole vibe of the song, because after all, vibe is way more important than some little tweak on your hi-hat. Once you've got your mix prepped and you've got some sort of rough mix going and you want to really start digging into the mix, start in the loudest section first. What I do is I'll loop the loudest section, because that's where you're going to be hitting your compressors the hardest. That's where you're going to see if you're going to have any issues with overloading something, maybe overdriving a plugin or maybe overdriving a subgroup or something like that. That's where you want to start, because it's easier to work backwards and automate more compression or bring a volume up in a quiet section than trying to go and fix a bunch of stuff that's overdriven and redlining everything. Loudest section first. When you're mixing, avoid soloing tracks too often or for too long, because it doesn't really matter what you do with that thing soloed up, how much you tweak it out and all that. It's never going to sound the same once you put it back in the mix. Not to mention, it's also going to make other things sound different. I've noticed that if I'm tweaking out a snare drum and messing around with the mid-range, it'll literally make my vocals or guitars appear to have more or less mid-range depending on what I'm doing with the snare drum. Everything's interacting. So I only use soloing to help identify a problem or just to make sure that there's not something weird going on, just more for verification, but I actually don't use soloing for mixing. Just remember, focus on the big picture. This is about how everything goes together, not how they sound individually. So, stay off the solo button. Make sure to always periodically check your mix in mono. There's a lot of good reasons to do that. One is, sometimes when using a keyboard sound or a keyboard plugin, some of these manufacturers will throw the left and right out of phase or have some effects out of phase to kind of impress you because it'll kind of make it seem like it's wider. But when you bring all that together in the center, you're going to get some phasing issues and some of that sound's just going to disappear. Also, if you've got live drums and you've got multiple mics, you might have some issues with your overheads. Bringing it to mono will show you if something's getting canceled out. You'll hear some of the cymbals disappear. Probably the main reason you want to check in mono is because if your music gets played in a public place like a club or like it's getting streamed into a restaurant or a grocery store, it's typically going to be in mono. And if you haven't done a mono check and you got phasing issues, some of that's just going to disappear. And the other reason is your pan law or your pan depth. That's something you should check as well because that will change the perception of how wide something is and will change how it appears when you play it back in mono. So, periodically check your mix in mono. When you're mixing, it's very important to take periodic breaks to rest your ears. I mean, mixing can take hours or days on a single mix, and I think it's real easy to A, wear your ears out, and B, start fooling yourself into thinking things sound a certain way. Me, I like to take breaks. I'll go upstairs, turn on the TV for a minute, or just listen to something from a completely different source in a different room, and it kind of resets my ears. The other reason why is just more physical. It's just not good to be sitting in this damn chair for hours at a time. In fact, many years ago when I mixed all the time every day, I actually injured myself doing that because I was spending hours and hours and hours mixing without moving. And it's one of the reasons why I had to switch to a trackball and can no longer use a mouse. I actually messed up my hand. I couldn't play bass for like a year because of that. So take breaks. Don't wear yourself out. This is a marathon, guys, not a sprint. If you want to get good mixes in your home studio, or any other studio for that matter, you need to make sure that you know what you're listening to. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is by listening to a lot of records in your mix position. I'm talking about your favorite records, or records that you think sound good, or even records that sound bad. Check them all out. Listen to lots of records. Listen to them on different speakers, at different volumes. Take notes on what they sound like. Check the low end. That way, when you're working on your own mixes or mixes for a client, it's easier for you to judge if what you're working on sounds good or is even in the ballpark. So listen to lots of different music in your mix position. One of the things I like to do when I'm about 3/4 of the way or so through a mix that helps me really tie up the mix is to listen to what I'm working on in different parts of the control room, to actually get out of my mix position. For instance, at my other studio, The Zone, where I do most of my mixing, I know if I'm sitting in the back corner on the couch where my clients normally sit, it's going to be a little boomy there. But I've spent a lot of time sitting in that spot, and I know how much boom there should be. I also know that in this studio here where I'm working now, if I stand over here to the left near that wall, it's going to sound a certain way. It's actually a little messed up, but I kind of know how it should be messed up. And another trick I like to do is to actually leave the control room and go out in the hallway or the next room over. So you go out there and just kind of make sure you're not in line of sight of any of the speakers and listen to your mix from out there, because it does this weird thing where everything kind of gets jumbled up like some sort of weird mono signal and goes out there. And if you do this a bunch and get used to it, you'll be able to start to identify certain things with your mix that, I don't know, it's just kind of like more of a way to casually listen instead of actively focused professionally listen. I don't know, but it's just a little technique I like to use a lot. If you really want to nail your mixes and improve your mixing skills, you should be A/Bing your current mixes with reference tracks on a regular basis. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Lately, I've been using this plugin here called ADPTR. I really like this thing because I can custom load in mixes that I'm used to hearing and switch back and forth with my mix to hear what it sounds like in comparison to something else. Or you can import your reference tracks into your Pro Tools sessions that you're working on and send them out of a different output from your interface. You don't want to send them out of the same output that you're using because it's going to hit the compressors and limiters and all that. Send them through a different output, bring them back into your controller or your mixer, and A/B there. The only way to really make A/Bing work is you've got to be able to do it quickly before your ear forgets what the last thing sounded like. That's the whole trick. A/Bing your mix with reference tracks will go a long way towards helping your mixes and training your ears. Well, that's it for today's episode. If you liked what you saw, hit the subscribe button. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.